Okay, this is a very quick look at the history of black club women from the 19th to the 20th century. Clubs were an important thing in the past, an important way for people to get together, to spend time together, to perform social service, to benefit their community, to worship, to all kinds of things. Black women were in an uncomfortable place that they were excluded from most black men's clubs. There would be exceptions. Sometimes they would be allowed to have a female auxiliary to the male club. And occasionally there were things like literary societies that might be for both men and women, but for the most part they were excluded. Similarly, they were excluded from white women's clubs. And to put that into a little bit of context, most anti-slavery groups were one race only. So, for example, white women might have an anti-slavery group, but it would not be open to black women to join. Antebellum era, before the Civil War, women began putting together their own associations, Black for Black Women. So a lot of them were mutual aid societies, and so in that case what it would basically be is a group in which everybody would contribute a little bit of money, and then in the case of an emergency, like you need to be buried, somebody lost your work, so you're starving, those kinds of emergencies, you could get some help. And so that was a way of providing provision for each other. And that was particularly important because a lot of charities did not help black people. So having that mutual support was an additional need for them. Literary societies where people talked about books and ideas. Church groups, both groups that were started by the church or were closely tied to the church to do various things for the church. But also there were religious groups where people would get together to pray on a weekly basis or bi-weekly basis. And finally, community improvement. Once again, because African Americans were excluded from so many things, it was important to try to build resources to support them. So, for example, groups that tried to work on developing schools or supporting schools for black children, supporting a black orphanage, other kinds of community improvements that specifically served the black community. Progressive era was a period of a great deal of social reform. It was also a period in which many white women joined reform organizations, and so did many black women. Their concerns were wide. Some of them were similar concerns to the concerns that white women had. So there was a lot of black women who were supporters of women's suffrage, the move for women to get the right to vote. There were many black women who became members of groups that were designed to support temperance, the fight to restrict alcohol drinking. And there were women who got in groups that became involved in projects like providing nurseries for children of working mothers, providing playgrounds for children to play at, providing other kinds of resources. They also were interested in challenging Jim Crow. Maybe not directly, but working to try to make Jim Crow or undermine Jim Crow. And actually that was one of the arguments that black women had for the importance of women getting the right to vote, is their hope was if they could vote, even though in the South black men couldn't vote, maybe they could push through reforms. That didn't work out, but there was definitely some of the groups were trying to be involved in ways of challenging Jim Crow. Challenging misogynoir. And that was an important thing. Women in these groups thought it was very important to show that they were respectable women, that they were good women, that they were strong women, that they were in no way like the stereotypes, the racial stereotypes that dominated popular cultural portrayals of black women. And of course, like I talked about before, community provision and reform. So trying to provide resources for members of the African American community. So trying to create community provisions, everything from old folks' homes to things to help support local schools, was another important part of the Black Women Club movement. 1896 is the creation of the National Association of Colored Women. That's the national organization that brings together large numbers of groups of Black women. And at the center of this movement to become national was a movement led by elite Black women in Boston, Philadelphia, New York, D.C. These women were often the wives of respectable working men or beauticians or other kinds of entrepreneurs, and they saw themselves as leaders of Black women, the Black female community. And that does create a certain amount of tension because they saw themselves as leaders, because they saw themselves as showing an example for other Black women, and there were many Black women who saw that as patronizing and believed that that was an attack on them and their choices. So there was a fair amount of class tensions that developed. There were also church groups that often, in some cases, specifically were involved in projects for churches, and then also larger church groups. The largest of them was the National Baptist Women's Convention, still in existence today. They raised their own money. The leadership was women only. These church groups were an opportunity for local women who probably didn't have the opportunity to travel like some of the women who were members of the elite. You know, it allowed them to take leadership roles, communicate with sisters across the nation, have exposure to new ideas, and put their civic skills into action. So what were the benefits of these groups? Well, there was a lot of them. One of them was mutual support. It gave women an opportunity to be with other women like themselves. And you can imagine one of the photos I showed you a couple months back was actually from a Black women's group in Montana. And you can just imagine for those women being able to come together and work together could be a really important opportunity. Developing organizational skills. This was a chance for women to be in charge and demonstrate the kind of skills and abilities that they have. Develop their leadership skills, to be the leaders for once, to be the people telling other people what to do, to develop the skills they might not have otherwise had a chance to develop. And of course, a certain amount of opportunities for community status. So the Black women clubs were important for community development. A lot of times they provided the only resources there for people like Black children. It offered personal opportunities for development and for travel and for personal experiences. And they also played an important role in confronting racism.